Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. Welcome to the OT is In podcast. Today, I have the very esteemed Dr. Roseann, or Dr. Ro, as you often hear her called or referring to herself. She's a mental health innovator and the founder of the Global Institute of Children's Mental Health and of Dr. Roseann LLC. She's dedicated to reshaping mental health perceptions and treatments. And through her neurotastic brain formulas and trademark brain behavior reset method, she provides science-backed holistic therapies to tackle conditions such as ADHD, anxiety, OCD, and PANS PANDAS. She's the author of 3 books, including It's Gonna Be Okay, and she's also host of the podcast by the same name, It's Gonna Be Okay. Roseann offers a reassuring voice in the parenting and mental health wellness sphere, emphasizing science-driven tools for brain calmness and family harmony. And even better for us, she's a fellow homeschooling mom, so she really gets us. Dr. Roseann brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion on how dysregulated nervous system impacts children's behavior, learning, and overall well-being. Today, we'll explore the importance of reframing clinical issues, understanding signs of under and overstimulation, and the critical role of parental self-regulation. Dr. Roseann will share practical strategies to help our children thrive, from breathwork techniques to creating a calmer mealtime environment. Plus, Dr. Roseann will share her professional perspective into the debate on using psychiatric medication as a first line of defense, and to discuss alternative interventions that can make a real difference. So whether you're a parent, a teacher, or just someone interested in mental health, this episode is packed with valuable insights and actionable advice to better understand and support children facing dysregulation. In episodes 29 through 32, you'll be hearing more about sensory processing. As we are beginning the school year, I don't know about you, but I feel even more demands. Even though I truly believe we're learning all the time, even through the summer, fall brings new rhythms, new routines, sports practices, co-ops starting, everything. This year, our family were even making dietary changes requiring more time cooking. My kids need me differently, and I need to be available to them. And this requires me to be intentional about my own sensory processing so that I can co-regulate with them. My body must be regulated so that they can be. You'll be learning more about this during the podcast, but we do go even deeper in the sensory balanced homeschool focus group. So this is a month-long class where new material comes to you in bite-sized chunks every week. You'll learn about each of the 8 sensory systems, ways to study your student to find more about their needs, strategies to help regulate the brain and body, and most importantly, a community of other homeschool families like yourself. I did mention that it's a month long, but I also know how busy that we can get as homeschool moms. So you have lifetime access to the group, including an invitation to our live question and answer, which happens approximately every 3 months in that group. We'd love to have you join us. You can find more information at homeschoolot.com, or more specifically, homeschoolot.com/sensory-focus-group. Hope to see you there. Now, on with the show. Hey, and welcome back to the OT is in podcast. Today I have Dr. Roseann here with us, and we met this summer at a conference where we were both speaking. And for a bit, I was like, wait a minute, she's talking about a lot of the same things that I talk about. But then we had the most wonderful discussion, and I was like, we do talk about a lot of the same things. And so, therefore, I need to be sharing what you are saying, sharing you with everyone else. So, can you tell us, first of all, who you are and also about your homeschool?
Yeah, I'm so glad I met you. We were both at the Homeschooling Special Needs Expo, and it was a wonderful conference. So, my name is Dr. Roseann Kapana-Hodge. I am an integrative mental health expert and an expert in kids' mental health. And for 3 decades, I've been supporting kids with wired differently brains in a lot of different ways, but really teaching them about the power of their own parenting and natural solutions and how to take a dysregulated nervous system and making them become. And of course, I wind up having wired differently kids, and I'm a homeschooling mom as well. It's something I'm really passionate about, and you get to create your own learning path for your kids, and you're in charge of it. How about that?
So good. So good. So, when you're talking about, you said dysregulated and then you have differently wired kids, tell me a little bit more like what definition of dysregulation do you use?
Yeah. When I talk about, I want people to reframe their thinking about clinical issues. That's really my Miss America platform, as I like to say, right? And it's about thinking about the nervous system, right? And so we have signs of understimulation and overstimulation, and our nervous system is affected by a lot of things. But some of those signs of understimulation can be, things like ADD-like behaviors, like being unfocused or learning and processing issues where you're sluggish and memory issues, or even internal worry. And then on the overstimulated side, it can be easily being emotional or irritated or sensory defensive or angry or a combination, right? And so when our nervous system reacts like this, we start to look for clinical labels. But when we reframe what we know about clinical issues and we start saying, what's the behavior? What's there? What am I seeing? And we start addressing that behavior, then what we're doing, right? Those are the outward signs that our nervous system needs a little TLC. And when we give the nervous system TLC, right? So maybe the driver is sensory dysregulation. Maybe the driver is junky food. Maybe it is, I had somebody yesterday I was working with, two really angry parents who were upset that their
Right?
kids are angry. And I was like, literally said to them, you are the mirror. Right.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean every kid who's angry has angry parents. I don't want you to think that. There are a lot of reasons, right? Maybe it is an educational environment, not at home. You're coming into a homeschooling environment. Maybe that educational environment was traumatizing for your child and left their
Right.
nervous system very disrupted. So it's really to get people to understand that nervous system dysregulation, which starts a lot with parents, but there are so many ways we can positively help a nervous system regulate so that your kid can be more focused, a better learner, how about more pleasant and cuddly? And it doesn't matter what area of dysfunction or difficulty or whatever you want to call it. I don't want anybody to feel offended. Those signs of dysregulation are literally a red flag, like that your child is like, I need some help.
Yes. And I love the way that you separated, or you said a lot of times we'll go straight for, we want to nip that behavior in the bud, but we're not necessarily looking at the underlying
Yeah.
why and asking that question. And even so, then maybe we say, okay, so the why is dysregulation, but then why is that? I
Right.
love that. Even you're like, is it the environment? Is it something that we're mirroring? Is it, there's so many different options. So, how do parents begin to look at how do we move from dysregulation to regulation?
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to do is put our own oxygen masks on, and we have to self-regulate ourselves. And that is actually probably the hardest thing that you're going to
Yep.
do. We always think it's the hardest thing to help our kids, right? I don't like to use the word fix. Sometimes people come into me and say, Dr. Rowe, I want you to fix my kid. And I'm like, I'm the wrong person to work
Yeah.
with because that's not
Good
what
luck
we're
with
talking
that.
about here.
Not broken.
No, exactly. Can we alleviate symptoms? Can you completely remove symptoms? Of course. course. Yeah, absolutely. That's different. We want our kids to feel regulated and happy and in control, but we have to do what we can to regulate ourselves, right? Remove critical language for ourselves and our kids. You get rid of all those fears, those worries that like just constantly are nagging us and nagging us. And that really requires work. It might be looking at what's your stuff that you're bringing in. I got a dysregulated kid. He reminds me very much of a family member that I literally can't stand. And so I literally have to work on it all the time and say to myself, he is not a reflection of that person, even though the behaviors are there. And I share this openly with people because I'm a human being. We are human beings, and that means we come with little imperfections. And but knowing something and not taking action, right? No, you got to know and then do, right? And so starting there, regulating gives you multiple avenues of helping your child. Number one, your child regulates off of you. I don't care if they're 37, I don't care if they're 3. I think we know this when our kids are toddlers and they're a
Right.
hot mess, right?
And how we're setting the tone in our own homes. Yes, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And then we forget when they move, we're like, well, they're 10, they should know that. Guess what? Their nervous system is dysregulated for a reason. Maybe it's developmental immaturity. Maybe it's all that. So we have to meet kids where they're at. So that part of it, but then it also gives us a different vantage point. So I talk a lot about taking a 360 aerial view. We can't step back and look at those sources to our kids' behavior or possible solutions unless we're calming ourselves down. I always talk about coming in hot. If you're coming in hot, you're not going to see it accurately. You're going to see it through like this irritation, right? And when I mean coming out in hot, it doesn't mean you're outwardly angry. It could mean you're upset, could mean you're worried. So you have to regulate not just for your child, but for yourself, right? And so when we can start really becoming more of a parent detective, we can see some of those clues, right? Maybe it is, as I'm sure, I know you talk a lot about sensory components. Maybe it's sensory. Maybe your kids got sensory issues that's interfering with their diet. So then they're not getting enough nutrition. And then then there's nutrient deficiencies. And then that's driving some of these sluggish processing or over emotional crying or the WWE smackdown with their sibling all the time. That's important to really start looking at it in a way that you're not ignited.
You're talking about if you see you're becoming a student of your student, basically, when you're looking at this nice view of, okay, the underlying why. But there's a lot of parents who are like, I don't even know where to begin. Like, how do I decide why? I have no idea.
You can really, it's through observation, right? So what you want to do, and Sarah and I, when we worked in a school, I used to work in a school, I would go and sit and observe, right? So I remember a long time ago, I had a preschooler, right? And he was getting aggressive and nobody could figure out why. Nobody could figure out why. And I was like, I think you need to observe more than one day because I'm not really seeing why either. And you want to go in, right? I'm not emotionally connected to this child. And again, you're a human being. You are emotionally connected to this child. But what I learned was that he was actually retaliating from something that happened 2 days before. You're in preschool. And no, he's not a serial killer. And but you then you really have to look and say, what's going on? So my child doesn't want to transition, doesn't want to sit and do her work. So then you back up. And this was a real conversation. And somebody said to me, my kid, every time we move from the device into our schoolwork, they don't want to do it. And I'm like, what are you doing in between? You need a physical activity in between. And they were like, and so you want to unpack it, you want to look at it, you want to understand, are you and your partner or whoever else is helping, are you generally consistent with how you're instructing your wired differently kid or even your neurotypical kid? Kids need a lot more reinforcement. And maybe the expectations are unreasonable. Maybe your child is literally saying, I don't understand what I have to do. And you're like, but you should understand. Sometimes people need, especially neurodivergent kids, need a lot more reinforcement. So you want to start looking at what we call as behaviors antecedents. What's happening before
Such a better term, because then we're not just so focused on what is going on
That's right.
and what's happening to me and how I'm reacting then back, but instead we're thinking of the antecedent. Yes, that's such a
Yes.
better plan.
Right. And even if you are losing your stuff,
Mhm.
right? Okay, you're allowed to lose your stuff. I tell people they have to be
Of
80%
course.
free, right? If
I love it.
if you're 80% losing your stuff, we got ourselves a problem here, Sarah, right? That means you have to look more at yourself. Maybe you
Yeah.
are. Like in the case of these parents, I'm telling you, they were literally the igniters of this kid's anger. And I let them know.
Did that go over?
I used some potty words with it too, because it needed to happen. But one person didn't like it, and the other person was super grateful for me
Yeah.
to actually say that
Yeah.
out loud.
Mhm.
So they are going to take action on it, and they're going to do some stuff on it. Sometimes we just think, especially when you're a neurodivergent and you have a neurodivergent child, you think, I'm okay, they're okay, I'm homeschooling, and that's all they need. But we still need interventions. We
Mhm.
still need the right intervention for what they need. And I think this is why these conversations are important, because you offer support in those areas in the sensory and the occupational therapy, and super valuable. And I offer a lot of behavioral support and parenting support for parents, because it is tricky. Nobody ever thinks they're going to have a wired differently kid. I
Right.
didn't think I'd have a wiredly different kid, and I got two.
Yeah. Yeah. I say a lot. I'm like, homeschooling is not alone schooling. What is important is that we recognize that parents are in charge of their team. They're the experts, they're the leaders in their team, but there's so many supports that are out to help and really to provide these resources so that you're not going at this alone.
Yeah. And
Now,
you're navigating and trying to find
yeah.
things on the internet and with some random health coach or a mom
Mhm.
who's had that experience. And not to say you can't learn, you really need to have an expert who has clinical training, right?
Yeah,
You
there's a
know?
lot of value in hearing from other people in the same boat as you, but it's never the exact same boat, right?
Yeah,
It's never going to
right.
be the exact same situation with the same environment and the same kid and who needs and wants to do the same things. And so to be able to help to support by through that observing and to be able to generalize more into, okay, this is how we can help in your situation.
That's right.
That takes a whole different level of expertise. Really is.
It really does. And we are so bio individual, and
Mhm.
there are a lot of environmental factors. And I didn't say this, but I can promise you, despite what maybe your partner thinks or your mother-in-law, kids don't act like this on purpose.
Yeah.
They may be acting like this because they don't know another way to act. That's another piece that needs to be removed. That notion that, yeah, my kid, okay, they are lying. Okay, why are they lying? Is that
Right.
their go-to behavior because they're ashamed? Then what can we do to stop the shame? So
Mhm.
behaviors just, that is the language of children. And we then have to
Beautiful.
look at why it's happening, because that's where we make change that makes kids feel good, family ecosystems feel good, reduces stress, and really empowers kids. Homeschooling is just one part.
I'm going to interrupt this episode for a bit of a funny story. Well, at least it's funny now. When we started homeschooling, this wouldn't have been so funny. My daughter was in 4th grade and she is now in 11th for a bit of perspective. But I did not trust myself, nor did I know how long this experiment of home education while moving to a new state was going to last. I didn't want her to learn math differently than her peers so that she'd be ready when she went back to, quote, real school. In Pennsylvania, our school systems allow us to borrow curriculum, so I borrowed their math curriculum. But they don't let us borrow the teacher's guide, only the student portion. So every day, my 4th grader and I would sit down and do math together. I had a 1st grader and a 1-year-old also running around my feet, and I never knew if I was 100% correct because I didn't have the answers. So we dove into an introduction to decimals and fractions, but it did not take long before we were both frustrated. Before we both dreaded what I heard was going to be this beautiful experience of us learning together. She finally said to me, "Mom, your brain is not like mine. Dad does it better." Sucker punch. I'd like to think that I reacted beautifully, but I don't think that I did. Our relationship was suffering, And looking back, that dread was causing me to be tense, and it affected the rest of my day, as well as my relationship with my then 6-year-old and 1-year-old. She was not learning at the pace she wanted, and nor was she retaining as much information. Because as you know through these episodes, memory and retention require sensory regulation. Neither of us were regulated. So we started using CTC math, and our homeschool changed. She was able to go at her pace, moving through lessons and spending time in areas that she needed or with new concepts, but not with things that she already understood. She stayed with CTC math until last year when she took pre-calculus and now calculus at our community college for college credit. But more importantly, our relationship did not have this daily disruption. So if you're looking for a math curriculum that works with your kids at their pace and where you can be as involved or as uninvolved as your relationship allows, CTC Math is a perfect fit. So visit ctcmath.com. Now back to the show. Right. So when we're talking some about the underlying why, so we've observed and we're like, okay, so this is what's happening here, but there's a lot of things that we can't actually see what's going on inside of their bodies and why they're feeling dysregulated. And you do a lot of work with that part too. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I actually I do brain scans. I do something called QEEG brain mapping. And people, most of my clients who come to work with me in Connecticut are not local. About 95% of people drive or they fly in one time. And I've done over 10,000 brain maps. That's what they're called, QEEG brain maps. And it gives us a real quantitative look at what is happening in a nervous system. And when we see when a brain is over and understimulated exactly where it is, you can really connect to what's happening in the brain to what's happening in behavior. Now, not everybody can come in and do that, right? I've created different programs where people can get more support. And now I can reverse it and say, here's the behavior. This is the area of the brain that's experiencing dysregulation. And here's what you can do about it. But everyone always thinks you're going to go and do testing at school and you're going to know exactly what your clinical problem is or any of that. Not to say that some of that isn't incredibly valuable, but putting a label on something can be useful to some degree because it could bring understanding. But we've got to start thinking about what is that behavior and what can I do to support that behavior? But I really have had the privilege of really looking. It's one of the coolest things that I do.
Yes.
It is awesome. You got to see some of the brain maps and it just takes the guesswork out of it.
Yeah.
Every day people come to me and they've done a lot. I get people where I'm the first stop, but that doesn't happen too often.
I was going to say those people stumbled on something really smart, really
You
fast.
know what it is? Every time I get somebody like that, they typically have a kid who's almost autistic. So
yeah.
Very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, and they are told right out of the gate to medicate. I've had clients be told their kids should be institutionalized. And so they right out go, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
And they just start Googling and start reading and listening to podcasts. And then they just open up. I had somebody recently come to me and they were like, every road I looked at led to Dr. Roseann. So here we are.
Here we are.
And I'm really for people who I'm not pro medication. I'm actively against psychiatric medication as the first line defense for children. We should never, they're handing it out like candy without saying, what does this kid need? What does this family need? And they're not really empowering parents to all the beautiful things that they could do, right?
Oh, I love this. So many options. And
So
not
many
that that's a
options.
terrible thing if that's what's needed, but as the first line of defense, when we haven't discussed other options.
Yeah, they're not talking. They're not, oh, your kid's literally bouncing on the walls or bouncing into kids. No, they're literally going to give them a psychostimulant. They're never going to talk to them about occupational therapy. They're going to talk to them about a behavioral therapist. And parents often wind up going to these things later and finding out from other parents or on their own. And these kinds of things can be nervous system resetters for kids.
Right.
But then when you're actually doing, and I say this all the time, like a dysregulated nervous system can't learn. Okay.
Yes.
You can't learn. You can't pay attention. You can't take action in the way because your body and brain is not going to allow you. But
Yeah,
when
you're literally
not available. And people say, isn't that what medication is for? No, it's not. And medication, there aren't medications that are corrective. And 70% of the time, psychiatric medications are used what's called off label. So there's no clinical research to show that it works. And autistics are a perfect example of them. Almost all autistics are medicated, but there's only one SSRI that's been approved for autism in
Oh.
some scope, depending on your
Mhm.
age. So yet these are the first things we do. And parents are like, they are in shock that nobody talks
Yeah.
to them about some of these other interventions that you can do, which can feel very overwhelming on what do I select? What do I do? And there's no magic wand. And
Right.
often when our wired differently kids, we do need to do multiple interventions. And the earlier you do them, the better. Absolutely. We know this through research. I can tell you that anecdotally as somebody who's been doing this for 3 decades. Do you feel the same? You get a
Yeah.
kid really young, it makes a huge difference.
It
But I
definitely
also
makes
work
a
with
huge
people in their
difference. Although interestingly, there was a recent article that was a meta-analysis that looked at the amount of therapy so that it doesn't have to be a continuous, we need this amount of, there's no map that says we need this amount of therapy starting at this age, and that's going to make a difference. So what that article, and I'll make sure it's linked here in the show notes, basically was empowering parents to think specifically for their child and not look at I have to start here and I have to continue with therapy and we need as much as we can right now. And then kids are just burnt out. And
Yeah.
so I was so excited to read it. I was like, yes, parents, yes, there is not one
Well,
right way to do this.
no, and I think it's often surprising to parents. Research shows us that when we do breath work, okay,
Mhm.
for as little as 10 minutes a day, that in 40
Oh,
days, it changes the brain permanently.
yeah.
It's free.
Right.
So it's how are you going to fit it in? And there's lots of fun ways to fit that in. But that's how impact regulating your nervous system can be. We're pulling ourselves from a stress, when we're doing breath work, we're pulling ourselves from a sympathetic dominant stress state down into a parasympathetic. And that's how much your brain needs it, that it can change your brain. And we're just bombarded with stress, right?
Can
And
you
homeschoolers,
explain a little bit more for our listeners, the difference
yeah,
in parasympathetic and
sure,
sympathetic and what that
sure.
means?
So we have an autonomic nervous system. It's called ANS, and it is the part of our nervous system that manages stress. And our body knows no difference between good or bad stress. Bad stress, getting in a car accident, good stress, you're having a baby.
Right.
And so when we become stressed, we move from a relaxed parasympathetic state and it moves into a sympathetic dominant state. And in a healthy nervous system, right? Oh my gosh, that car just cut me off. Goes right up to a sympathetic dominant. Your cortisol levels start going, all these things start happening in your body, but then it goes back
It
down,
goes right back
right?
down. Mhm.
But when you're constantly in stress, which, kids with learning issues, kids that are having nutrient deficiencies, their nervous systems just start moving into the sympathetic dominant state. And at the extreme of sympathetic dominant, you have what's called fight, flight, or freeze. They're adding on fawn now too.
Fun.
And so, it's often perplexing for parents when, I'm homeschooling them, I'm giving them great food, I'm loving, we're praying together, all these things. And you say, why are they irritated or fearful? It's because of the different components that cause your nervous system to get activated.
Mhm.
And yes, while it can be a single event or lots of little events, most of the time, what I am seeing in the greatest change I've seen in this 30 years, it's not a single event. It's multiple things causing this nervous
Long
system to
term.
act. Yeah. It could be sensory, constant sensory deficiency, difficulties. It can be those nutrient deficiencies because of sensory processing, tactile issues. Picky eating is the thing. You were with me at the conference. Everybody wants to talk to me about picky
About
eating.
picky, yes. Yeah,
And
talk about that for a quick second
yeah,
and nutrition.
yeah, picky eating. Listen, our brain is affected by what we eat. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter if you're 57 or you're 3. We need good
Right.
nutrients. And so picky eating is happening often because of sensory issues. That is the number one thing that I see that starts
Yep.
driving it. Then the nervous system gets dysregulated. Then the dysregulation starts feeding the picky eating. It becomes a vicious cycle, and it is something people just are afraid to address, but actually really good nutrition, whole food, brain food is one of the most powerful interventions parents have in their hands.
So, but what if parents are like, yeah, I'm in on that. I really want that, but my kid won't eat it.
Yeah, you have to really dig in. I know we have a program called the Dysregulation Solution, and we added this whole section of picky eating because we needed to. And there is a process to help your kids move from being a picky eater to not being a picky eater. And it's a process,
Yeah,
right?
long
So
term.
I would say the number one thing is addressing sensory needs. And then really also you got to change your food.
Yeah.
You can't just keep offering. My cousins are here from Italy, and I'm actually first generation American, and my parents are from Italy. And my cousins' kids are like my kids. They've never eaten off of a kids menu. They
Mm.
eat real food. Like they had never like they were giving them the kids menu, and they were like, "What is this?"
I don't want grilled cheese.
Yeah, please,
Brown food.
Yeah. They eat a range of food. And I'm not trying to shame anybody because it's really hard. And I feel that I would say 50% of the neurodivergent population deals with picky eating.
Mhm.
Nutrient deficiencies could be part of it. You want to dig deeper as to why that's happening. And don't just and again, you have to have different options and there's a whole process around that, helping your kid make choices around their foods, prepare foods. Preparing foods, I think, is probably the second greatest strategy you can make.
To do it with your kids? Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
And I'm a big fan of cooking. There isn't a skill they don't learn through cooking, but
Mhm.
most importantly, they get to complete things. And
Yeah,
there's such a powerful feeling of happiness and success when you
I love
complete
that.
things, right?
Yeah.
And when kids have control, okay, listen, hey, we're trying a new vegetable today. You get to pick it out. We're making a recipe and you're going to try it. Kids will try it. And
Yeah.
sometimes they convert into that. But you got to regulate your nervous system. These kids are so dysregulated, they're stressed. And especially when you have homeschoolers that came from school, because we did that, like we tried. And then
Same.
it felt like we all had PTSD, right? And then like it was like the breathing. Oh, okay. And my kid wasn't a picky eater. He just wasn't eating enough at school because it was
Mhm.
too much. So that even just that change of having a real lunch
Yeah.
had huge positive
That's
impact
again
on
that
his learning.
environmental piece of you can calm it down. Like we put candles on our table at the beginning and we still do it sometimes, but because by the time that we were getting to lunch, my daughter used to have lunch at 10:47 every day in school. Like, why? We just got here. Like
I know.
it's still breakfast time. But anyway, she was so used to eating really early and eating really fast. And so as we were trying to change our schedule a little bit, by the time we would get to lunchtime, she was a hot mess. And
Yeah.
so we would need to calm everything down. We would light candles. This was not my original idea, but we call it lit lunch. And we would listen to books and light our candles. And it was like
I
the
love that.
thing
It's
that saved our
beautiful.
morning. It was
Yeah.
not my original idea, but we've been doing it for several years now. We're going into our ninth year of homeschooling. So it's been a beautiful experience. And that is part of that change of the environment to help to holistically regulate.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
what are some of the best resources that you offer or things, other recommendations that you make to families?
Yeah. I have a ton of free resources. You can go to drroseann.com, DROSEANN.com. And I have my podcast, I have blogs. I talk a lot about practical solutions
Mhm.
that people can do. And as I said, knowledge is power, but you got to take action.
Yeah,
You can't just be like, I'm going to keep learning. So I talk a lot about just taking one strategy, right? We
love
talked
it.
about a bunch today, and then being consistent with it for 30 days. I think that's the part where people think I learned it or their
Mhm.
brother learned it. But when your kid is wired differently or their nervous system is dysregulated, however you want to think about it, they need more practice and
Yes.
reinforcement. But I really pride myself on providing science-backed solutions, and that's
Mhm.
what I offer. And so there's other programs and different things. We offer lots of things for wherever people are at.
So beautiful. And so you said, Dr. Roseann, they can find you. What's your podcast called?
Oh, my podcast is called It's Gonna Be Okay. It's science-backed solutions for kids with attention, and we're always changing the sub name, but you can just search. If you can't find it, just search Dr. Roseann on iTunes or Spotify or whatever, will show up.
Perfect. And we'll make sure all that is linked in the show notes too. So thank you so much for being here, for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'm sure, like you said, we covered a whole lot of stuff, but I know that there's a few takeaways within there. And again, start with one of them, right? Like we don't need to do all the things all at one time, but instead pick one that you think can make a difference in your child's life and stick with it.
That's exactly right.
Perfect. Thank you again. And I will see you soon.